The blood on Quentin Frost's hands never quite washed clean, no matter how many times he plunged them into the icy mountain streams or scrubbed them raw with lye soap in the darkness of his cabin. He had sailed under black flags across waters so dark they seemed to swallow the stars whole, done things that haunted his sleep and made him wake gasping in the thin mountain air, reaching for weapons that weren't there. The only peace he found now was in the towering pines of the Wyoming Territory, where the wind through the needles sounded like the whispers of absolution he knew he didn't deserve. It was the spring of 1878 when Quentin first saw her, and the sight stopped him dead in his tracks like a bullet to the chest. He'd come down from his isolated claim in the mountains, riding into Fort Laramie with a season's worth of pelts strapped to his pack mule, his dark hair hanging past his shoulders, his massive frame wrapped in buckskin and fur. The settlements sprawled along the North Platte River, a collection of rough buildings and rougher men, but she stood out like a rose growing from stone. Fiona Sutherland was trying to control a spooked horse outside the general store, her auburn hair escaping from its pins, her green eyes flashing with determination and frustration in equal measure. The animal reared, and Quentin moved without thinking, his powerful legs carrying him forward in 3 long strides. He caught the reins with one hand and the horse's halter with the other, his muscles bunching beneath his shirt as he steadied the frightened creature with a low, rumbling voice that seemed to come from somewhere deep in his chest. "Easy now," he murmured, more to the horse than the woman, though his dark eyes found hers over the animal's neck. "Easy." The mare settled almost immediately, responding to the calm authority in his tone. Fiona stared at him, her chest rising and falling rapidly, one hand pressed to her throat. She was beautiful in a way that made his breath catch. Delicate features and fair skin that spoke of a life far removed from these rough territories. But there was steel in her gaze, too, a strength that intrigued him. "Thank you," she said, her voice carrying the cultured accent of the East Coast. "She's not usually so skittish." Something must have startled her. Quentin nodded once, handing her the reins, careful not to let his scarred, calloused fingers touch her gloved hands. Rattlesnake, probably. Ground's warming up, they're moving around. He turned to leave, uncomfortable with the way she looked at him, as if she could see through the layers of fur and leather and muscle to the darkness underneath. But her voice stopped him. "Wait, please, I'm Fiona Sutherland. I arrived 2 weeks ago from Boston to teach at the new schoolhouse." She gestured toward a fresh-painted building at the edge of town. "I haven't had the chance to thank anyone properly for their help yet, and you've just saved me from a potentially serious accident." "No need for thanks, madam." His voice was rough from disuse, gravelly as creek stones. "Just doing what any man would do." "I disagree. Most men here seem to find entertainment in watching a woman struggle." There was a bite to her words, and he noticed the dark circles under her eyes, the tension in her shoulders. Life in Fort Laramie clearly wasn't what she'd expected. Quentin shifted his weight, aware of people watching them, of the way conversations had stopped in the street. He didn't come to town often, and when he did, people gave him a wide berth. Stories followed him like shadows, whispers about his past, about the scars that covered his back and chest, about the darkness in his eyes. Some said he'd been a pirate. Others claimed he'd been a mercenary in foreign wars. A few insisted he'd murdered his way across the territories. The truth was worse than any of their guesses, and he had no intention of sharing it. "You should be careful, madam. Wyoming Territory's no place for a woman alone." Her chin lifted. "I'm quite capable of taking care of myself, Mr. Frost." Quentin Frost. The name felt heavy on his tongue, a reminder of everything he'd tried to leave behind. "Well, Mr. Frost, I appreciate your concern, but I came here to make a difference, to educate children who might otherwise have no opportunity for learning. I won't be frightened away by a few challenges." Despite himself, Quentin felt a flicker of admiration. She had courage, he'd give her that. Foolish courage, perhaps, but courage nonetheless. "Good luck to you then, Miss Sutherland." This time when he turned away, she let him go, but he felt her eyes on his back all the way down the street. He conducted his business quickly, trading his pelts for supplies, avoiding conversation, ignoring the stares. The general store owner, a grizzled man named Patterson, counted out coins with fingers that trembled slightly. "That's a fair haul, Frost. You planning to stay in town a spell?" "No." Quentin loaded his purchases into his saddlebags with economical movements, heading back up tomorrow. Shame. We could use a man like you around here. There's been trouble lately. Cattle rustlers hitting the ranches to the south, and some of the Lakota bands are restless. Can't blame them, considering what the government keeps doing, but it makes things tense. Quentin grunted, not interested in getting involved. He'd had his fill of conflict, of violence, of blood and screaming, and the terrible things men did to each other. The mountains were his sanctuary, and he guarded that peace jealously. But that night, sleeping in the stable loft because he couldn't stomach the thought of four walls around him, he dreamed of green eyes and auburn hair, of a voice like music in the wilderness. He woke before dawn, disturbed and angry at himself, and nearly rode out immediately. Instead, some impulse he couldn't name made him walk through the quiet town, past the schoolhouse where lamplight already glowed in the windows. He told himself he was just checking, making sure she was all right, that nothing had happened in the night. He told himself it meant nothing when he saw her silhouette moving behind the curtains, arranging desks, preparing lessons. He told himself a lot of lies as he swung up onto his horse and headed into the mountains, back to his cabin where the only sounds were wind and water and the occasional scream of a mountain lion. 3 weeks passed before he came down again. He didn't need supplies, had enough to last him months, but he found reasons anyway. He told himself it was responsible to check on the settlement, to keep aware of what was happening in the territory. He told himself it had nothing to do with a woman with fire in her hair and determination in her eyes. When he reached Fort Laramie this time, he found trouble waiting. A crowd had gathered outside the schoolhouse, and angry voices carried on the afternoon air. Quentin's jaw tightened as he recognized the scene, the tension that preceded violence. He dismounted and pushed through the crowd, his size and presence making a path where his words wouldn't have. Inside the schoolhouse, Fiona stood facing 3 men, her back straight, her face pale but resolute. One of them, a rancher named Colt Brennan with a reputation for meanness, had his hand on her arm. The children who should have been there were gone, sent away or fled. "I said no, Mr. Brennan." Fiona's voice shook but held firm. "The school is for all children, regardless of their heritage. If you don't want your son sitting next to the Johansson boy or the Martinez girl, then keep him home. But I will not segregate my classroom. You'll do what we tell you, schoolteacher." Brennan's fingers tightened. "We pay your salary. You work for us." "Actually," Quentin said from the doorway, his voice cutting through the room like a blade, "the territorial government pays her salary. And you're going to take your hand off her right now." Brennan spun, his face flushing red when he saw who had spoken. The 2 men with him shifted nervously. Everyone knew Quentin Frost, knew enough to be wary. "This ain't your business, mountain man. Get back to your hole." Quentin took 3 steps forward, and the temperature in the room seemed to drop. His dark eyes were flat, emotionless, the eyes of a man who had killed before and would do it again without hesitation if pushed. "I'm making it my business. Let her go." For a long moment the world balanced on a knife's edge. Then Brennan released Fiona's arm and stepped back, trying to salvage his pride with bluster. "Fine. But this isn't over, Miss Sutherland. You'll learn how things work here, or you'll leave. Simple as that." The 3 men pushed past Quentin and out the door. The crowd outside dispersed quickly, not wanting to be associated with the confrontation. When they were alone, Fiona sagged against her desk, one hand pressed to her mouth. Quentin could see her trembling now that the immediate danger had passed. "You all right?" he asked quietly. She nodded, then shook her head, then laughed shakily. "No, not really. That was terrifying." Her green eyes met his. "But thank you again. You seem to make a habit of rescuing me." "You keep needing rescuing." "I suppose I do." She straightened, smoothing her skirts, visibly pulling herself together. "But I meant what I said. I won't segregate the children. It's wrong, and I won't be part of it, no matter how much they threaten me. Brennan's not the type to make empty threats. Neither am I." Steel ran through her words, and Quentin felt that flicker of admiration again, stronger this time. She was either the bravest woman he'd ever met or the most foolish, possibly both. He looked around the schoolhouse, taking in the carefully arranged desks, the slate board covered in neat handwriting, the books stacked lovingly on shelves. It was clear she cared about this work, that it meant something to her beyond just a job. Why'd you really come here? Boston to Wyoming Territory's a hell of a jump. Fiona was quiet for a moment, and when she spoke, her voice was softer, more vulnerable. My father died last year, left debts. My mother remarried quickly to a man who, well, I needed to leave. The teaching position here was my chance to start over, to do something meaningful with my life, instead of just being ornamental in someone's parlor. Quentin understood running from the past. He understood it better than most. Starting over's harder than it sounds. I'm beginning to realize that. She moved to the window, looking out at the rough settlement beyond. But I'm not going back. Whatever happens, I'm staying. He should have left then. Should have walked out, ridden back to his mountains, forgotten about the schoolteacher with more courage than sense. But instead he heard himself say, I'll be staying in town a few days, making sure there's no more trouble. Her smile was like sunrise breaking over the peaks. You don't have to do that, I know. For 3 days, Quentin camped outside Fort Laramie, close enough to watch but far enough to avoid the settlement itself. He told himself he was just being cautious, that Brennan might try something. He didn't examine too closely why he found excuses to ride past the schoolhouse at noon, when the children spilled out for lunch, their laughter carrying on the wind. He didn't think about how his automatically searched for auburn hair, for the graceful figure moving among the students. On the 4th day, Fiona came to him. He was checking his horse's shoes when her shadow fell across the ground, and he looked up to find her standing there, a basket over her arm, looking nervous and determined. Mr. Frost, I was wondering if you might join me for supper. It's the least I can do to thank you for watching over the school. That's not necessary, madam, I know, but I'd like to, please. She paused, then added more quietly, and I could use the company, to be honest. It gets lonely here. Loneliness was something else Quentin understood. He straightened slowly, aware of how he must look to her, all rough edges and violence barely contained. But she didn't flinch, just waited with that same quiet courage she'd shown facing down Brennan. All right, he said finally, all right. She'd set up a small table behind the schoolhouse, in the shade of a cottonwood tree. The meal was simple, bread and cheese and dried apples, but she'd laid it out carefully, made it into something more than just sustenance. They ate in companionable silence at first, and Quentin found himself relaxing slightly, the constant tension in his shoulders easing. Tell me about the mountains, Fiona said eventually. What's it like there? Cold, beautiful in a way that hurts sometimes. He surprised himself with the honesty. The kind of place where you can hear yourself think. Is that what you wanted? To hear yourself think? Sometimes. Other times I want the opposite. Want the silence to drown everything else out. She studied him with those perceptive green eyes. You're running from something. Most people who come west are. He met her gaze steadily. You included. Fair enough. She smiled slightly. Though I prefer to think of it as running toward something rather than away. A new beginning. And have you found it? Your new beginning. I'm working on it. The children make it worthwhile. You should see them, Mr. Frost. They're so eager to learn. Even the ones who've never held a book before. Yesterday, Sarah Martinez read her first complete sentence. She was so proud, she cried. Fiona's whole face lit up as she spoke, and Quentin found himself captivated by the transformation. That's why I can't back down to men like Brennan. These children deserve every opportunity. Even if it costs you, even then. She poured them both coffee from a battered tin pot. What about you? What do you do up there in the mountains besides trap and hunt? Survive. Try to forget. The words slipped out before he could stop them, and he cursed himself for the weakness. But Fiona didn't press, didn't pry into wounds he wasn't ready to expose. The forgetting part's harder than it should be, isn't it? She said softly, and he knew she was thinking of her own ghosts, her own reasons for running. Yeah, it is. They talked until the sun set, and Quentin found himself sharing things he hadn't spoken aloud in years. Not the worst of it, not the things that woke him screaming, but small pieces of himself. He told her about learning to read the weather in the clouds, about tracking animals through snow, about the time he'd nursed a wolf pup back to health only to have it rejoin its pack come spring. She listened like she actually cared, asked questions that showed she was paying attention, and when she laughed at his story about a family of raccoons that had invaded his cabin, the sound made something in his chest tighten. When he finally stood to leave, she walked him to where his horse was tied. The settlement was quiet around them, windows glowing with lamplight, the sound of a piano drifting from the saloon down the street. "Thank you," Fiona said. "For supper, for the conversation, for everything. I didn't do anything. You did more than you know." She hesitated, then asked, "Will you come back? To Fort Laramie, I mean. Not just to check on trouble, but to visit." Every instinct told him to say no, to cut this connection before it grew into something he couldn't control. But he looked at her standing there in the twilight, hope and loneliness warring in her expression, and found himself nodding. "Yeah, I'll come back." Her smile was worth whatever price he'd pay for that promise. Quentin returned to the mountains, but they didn't bring the peace they once had. He worked hard, pushing his body to exhaustion, splitting wood and checking trap lines and repairing his cabin. But at night, staring up at the stars through the pines, he thought about green eyes and a laugh like music. He thought about the way Fiona spoke about her students, the passion and dedication in her voice. He thought about how long it had been since he'd felt anything other than guilt and the weight of his past. 2 weeks later, he rode down with a string of trout and a basket of wild strawberries he'd spent an afternoon gathering. He told himself he was just being neighborly, that it meant nothing. But his heart hammered against his ribs when he saw her in the schoolyard, and he knew he was lying to himself. Fiona's face brightened when she saw him. "Mr. Frost, what a pleasant surprise. Thought you might like these." He handed her the fish and berries, suddenly self-conscious. "The strawberries are best with cream if you can get it. This is wonderful. Thank you." She gestured to the schoolhouse. "I'm just finishing up for the day. Would you like to see what we've been working on?" He followed her inside, ducking through the doorway, his size making the space feel smaller. The children's work covered the walls, slates covered in letters, drawings of animals and landscapes. Fiona showed him each one with pride, explaining the students' progress, their challenges, their triumphs. Her enthusiasm was infectious, and Quentin found himself genuinely interested, asking questions, commenting on the work. "You're good at this," he said, "teaching. The children are lucky to have you." "I'm the lucky one. They give me purpose." She straightened a crooked picture. "Though I wish I had more materials, books especially. Most of the children share, and some of the families can't afford any at all." An idea formed in Quentin's mind, and before he could talk himself out of it, he said, "There's a trader comes through Cheyenne every month, deals in books and supplies from back east. I could ride down, see what he has." "You'd do that?" "If you make a list of what you need, yeah." "Mr. Frost, I can't ask you to—" "You're not asking. I'm offering," he met her eyes. "Besides, I need to go that way anyway. Might as well make it useful." It was a lie, and they both knew it, but Fiona didn't call him on it. Instead, she fetched paper and pencil and began writing, occasionally pausing to think, biting her lower lip in concentration. Quentin watched her, memorizing the curve of her cheek, the way escaped tendrils of hair framed her face, the graceful movement of her hands. When she finished, she handed him the list. "This is probably too much. Just get what you can. Whatever's affordable. I'll get it all." Quentin, his name on her lips, made his pulse jump. "I can't let you spend your money on this. Consider it an investment in the future." He folded the list carefully and tucked it into his shirt pocket. "Those children are the future of this territory. Seems worth investing in." Her eyes shimmered with emotion. "You're a good man." He shook his head, uncomfortable with the praise. "No, madam, I'm really not. I think you are. I think whatever you've done, whatever you're running from, you're more than that." She placed her hand on his arm, and even through the thick buckskin, he felt the warmth of her touch. "I see how you look at the children when you think no one's watching. I see the kindness in you, even if you try to hide it." Quentin pulled away gently, putting distance between them. "You don't know me, Fiona. You don't know what I've done." "Then tell me." "No." The word came out harsher than he intended. Some things are better left buried. He left before she could argue, before the compassion in her eyes could break down walls he'd spent years building. But her words followed him back to the mountains, echoing in his head, making him wonder if maybe, possibly, he could be more than the sum of his sins. The trip to Cheyenne took 3 days of hard riding. Quentin found the trader, a sharp-eyed man named Whitmore, and spent nearly all his savings on books and slates and chalk and paper. Whitmore raised his eyebrows at the quantity, but asked no questions, just packed everything carefully and wished Quentin well. On the ride back, a spring storm caught him in the open, rain lashing down in sheets, turning the trail to mud. He took shelter under an overhang, protecting the books as best he could, spent a miserable night shivering in wet buckskin. By the time he reached Fort Laramie, he was soaked through, exhausted, and coming down with a fever. But Fiona's expression when she saw the supplies made it all worthwhile. She actually gasped, her hands flying to her mouth, tears streaming down her face as she examined each book, each slate, touching them like they were precious jewels. "How did you? This must have cost a fortune." "Quentin, I can't accept this. Too late. Already bought." He swayed slightly, and she noticed immediately, her joy shifting to concern. "You're ill. When's the last time you slept?" "Been a while." "Come on." She took his arm, supporting him even though he probably weighed twice what she did. "You're staying at my cabin until you've recovered, and don't argue with me." He was too tired and feverish to protest. She led him to the small cabin behind the schoolhouse that served as her living quarters, helped him out of his wet jacket, and pushed him down onto the narrow bed. The room spun around him, and he closed his eyes, feeling her hands cool against his burning forehead. "Rest now," she murmured. "I'll take care of you." For 3 days, Quentin drifted in and out of consciousness. In his lucid moments, he was aware of Fiona's presence, her gentle hands bathing his face with cool cloths, coaxing him to drink water and broth. In his fevered dreams, he was back on the ship, back in the darkness, doing things that made him wake gasping, sometimes shouting words in languages she didn't understand. She never left him, never showed fear, just held his hand and whispered reassurances until he calmed. And when the fever finally broke, leaving him weak but clear-headed, he found her asleep in the chair beside the bed, her hand still clasping his, exhaustion written in every line of her face. He watched her sleep, this woman who barely knew him, who had nonetheless nursed him through the worst of the illness, who had seen him at his most vulnerable and hadn't run. Something shifted in his chest, something he'd thought long dead, stirring to painful life. When Fiona woke, she found him looking at her, and she smiled, relief flooding her features. "You're back." The fever broke. "How long?" 3 days. "You gave me quite a scare." She poured him water, helped him sit up to drink. "You kept talking in your sleep. About ships and darkness and people whose names I didn't recognize." Quentin's jaw tightened. "I'm sorry. Don't be. We all have ghosts." She sat on the edge of the bed, her expression serious. "But Quentin, whatever you're carrying, whatever you've done, it's eating you alive. I can see it. Some things can't be forgiven, can't they? Or won't you forgive yourself?" Her hand found his, fingers intertwining. "I was engaged once, back in Boston, to a man my mother chose. He was wealthy, respectable, everything a match should be on paper. He was also cruel. He hurt me, in ways that didn't leave visible bruises." Her voice trembled but held steady. "I stayed longer than I should have because I thought I deserved it, thought something was wrong with me. It took my father dying, took losing everything for me to find the courage to leave. Fiona, I'm telling you this because I understand shame. I understand feeling like you're broken beyond repair, but you're not. Neither of us is." She squeezed his hand. "You don't have to tell me everything, but don't shut me out completely, please." For a long moment, Quentin struggled with himself. Every instinct screamed at him to pull away, to protect her from the darkness inside him. But looking into her eyes, seeing the acceptance and understanding there, something in him broke. "I was a sailor," he said quietly. "Merchant marine at first, legitimate trade. But the ship I served on, the captain decided there was more money in other ventures. Smuggling, gun running. Eventually, worse. He couldn't look at her, focused on their joined hands instead. We raided other ships, took cargo, took lives. I told myself I didn't have a choice, that I was just following orders, but that's a coward's excuse. I participated. I killed people who didn't deserve to die." "How old were you?" The question surprised him. 16 when I signed on, 19 when it turned bad, 23 when I finally jumped ship in San Francisco and ran as far inland as I could get. You were young, trapped in an impossible situation. I was a murderer." The word tasted like bile, and the worst part is I was good at it. The violence came easy, too easy. "There's something wrong in me, Fiona. Something dark." She was quiet for a long time, and he braced himself for her disgust, for her to pull away. Instead, she lifted his hand to her lips and kissed his scarred knuckles gently. You were young and scared and trapped. What you did was wrong, yes. But what you're doing now, the man you're choosing to be, that matters too. You came to these mountains seeking redemption, and you've found it. You protect people, you're kind. Spent your savings on books for children you don't even know. That doesn't balance the scales. Maybe not, but it's a start. She met his eyes and hers were bright with unshed tears. I'm not asking you to forget what happened. I'm asking you to forgive yourself enough to allow yourself a future, to allow yourself to be happy. I don't know if I can. Then let me help you learn. Quentin stared at her, this incredible woman who had somehow seen past his walls to the broken man underneath and hadn't turned away. Slowly, carefully, he lifted his free hand and cupped her cheek. She leaned into the touch, her eyes falling closed, and he felt something he hadn't felt in years: hope. Why? He asked roughly. Why do you care? Because I see you, the real you, and I think. She opened her eyes, and the emotion in them made his breath catch. I think I'm falling in love with you. The words should have terrified him, should have sent him running back to the safety of the mountains. Instead, they filled him with a fierce, aching joy. Fiona, I'm not. I can't promise to be what you deserve. I don't want perfect. I want real. I want you. She turned her face to press a kiss to his palm. If you'll have me. In answer, Quentin drew her down and kissed her, gentle at first, then deeper as she responded, her arms sliding around his neck. She tasted like hope and new beginnings, and when they finally pulled apart, he rested his forehead against hers, breathing hard. I'm falling in love with you too, he admitted, probably already have. Her smile was radiant. Then we'll figure the rest out together. He stayed in Fort Laramie for 2 weeks, recuperating and spending every possible moment with Fiona. They walked together in the evenings after school let out, talking for hours about everything and nothing. She told him about her childhood in Boston, about her dreams for the future. He shared stories about the mountains, about the peace he found in the wilderness, and slowly, painfully, more about his past. The settlement watched their growing relationship with interest. Some approved, seeing Quentin as a stabilizing presence, a protector for the vulnerable schoolteacher. Others, like Brennan, muttered darkly about mountain men and propriety, but they kept their distance when Quentin was around. One evening, as they sat together watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Fiona asked, "What happens now? You have your life in the mountains. I have the school here. How do we make this work?" Quentin had been thinking about the same question. I could come down more often, every week, maybe. And in the summer, when school's not in session, you could come up, see the cabin, the high country. I'd like that. She leaned against his shoulder, and he wrapped his arm around her, marveling at how right it felt. But Quentin, I need you to know, I'm not giving up the school. Teaching is important to me, I know. I wouldn't ask you to. He kissed the top of her head. We'll make it work, whatever it takes. And they did. Through the summer of 1878 and into the fall, Quentin rode down from the mountains every week, sometimes more often. He helped repair the schoolhouse roof, built new desks, even taught the older boys about tracking and wilderness survival. The children adored him, this huge, quiet man who spoke gently and always had time for their questions. Fiona bloomed under his attention, becoming more confident, more joyful. She introduced new subjects at the school, fought the town council for better supplies, and with Quentin's backing, successfully integrated the classroom despite continued opposition from some families. Their love grew steadily, built on mutual respect and understanding, on shared values and the simple pleasure of each other's company. In November, as the first snows began to fall, Quentin took Fiona up to his cabin. The ride took most of a day, climbing into the high country where the pines grew thick and the air was sharp with cold and the scent of evergreen. When they crested the final ridge and she saw his homestead, she gasped. The cabin sat in a small clearing, backed by towering cliffs, fronted by a meadow that would be lush with wildflowers come spring. A stream ran nearby, its water crystal clear, and the view stretched for miles. Mountains rolling away in waves of blue and purple. It was beautiful and isolated and utterly peaceful. "Quentin, this is incredible." He helped her down from her horse, pleased by her reaction. "It's home, or has been. She caught the phrasing. Doesn't feel complete anymore. Feels empty when I'm here without you. He took her hands in his, and she could feel him trembling despite his size and strength. Fiona, I know we haven't known each other long. And I know I'm not much of a catch, with my past and my rough ways. But I love you, more than I thought I could love anyone. And I want to spend my life with you if you'll have me. Tears streamed down her face, but she was smiling. Are you asking what I think you're asking? I'm asking you to marry me, to build a life together, up here or down in Fort Laramie or wherever you want, as long as we're together. Yes. She laughed through her tears. Yes, absolutely yes. He swept her up, spinning her around, her laughter echoing off the mountains. When he set her down, he kissed her with all the love and passion he'd been holding back, and she responded with equal fervor, her hands tangling in his long hair, pulling him closer. They spent 3 days at the cabin, and Quentin showed her everything. The best fishing spots, the game trails, the hidden valley where elk gathered in winter. They talked about the future, about how to balance her teaching with his trapping, about building a larger cabin that could accommodate both their needs. She proved surprisingly adept at mountain life, unafraid of the work or the isolation, curious about everything. On their last night, they lay together on a pile of furs before the fireplace, watching the flames dance. Fiona traced the scars on Quentin's chest, the marks of his violent past, and he no longer flinched from her touch. I want to make you happy, he said softly. Want to give you everything you deserve. You already do. You make me happier than I've ever been. She propped herself up on one elbow, looking down at him. We're going to have a good life, Quentin. I can feel it. Yeah, we are. They were married in December in a simple ceremony at the Fort Laramie Chapel. The whole settlement turned out, even those who'd initially opposed their relationship. Fiona wore a dress of deep blue wool, and Quentin had gotten his hair trimmed and his beard shaped, though he still looked every inch the mountain man in new buckskins and a clean shirt. When they exchanged vows, his voice was steady and sure, and her eyes never left his face. The winter of 1878 into 79 was the happiest of Quentin's life. He moved between the mountains and Fort Laramie, establishing a routine. He'd spend a week trapping in the high country, then come down to spend several days with Fiona. She continued teaching, and he helped however he could, becoming an unofficial guardian for the school and its students. In February, trouble returned. A band of outlaws moved into the territory, hitting ranches and travelers, getting bolder with each success. The territorial marshal was overwhelmed, and Fort Laramie braced for an attack. Quentin found himself in demand, his reputation as a dangerous man suddenly an asset rather than a liability. He helped organize the town's defenses, teaching men how to shoot better, how to fortify positions, how to work as a unit. But he hated every moment of it, hated the way violence came back so easily, the way his old instincts kicked in. Fiona saw his struggle and held him through the nightmares that returned worse than before. We could leave, she said one night. Go somewhere safer. No, these people need help, and I'm not running anymore. He pulled her close. But I'm afraid, Fiona. Afraid of what I might become if there's fighting. You're not that person anymore. You're the man who reads to children, who builds desks, who loves me. That's who you are now. What if it's not enough? It will be. I have faith in you. When the outlaws came, they hit hard and fast, riding into town at dawn, shooting and shouting. But they found Fort Laramie ready. Quentin led the defense from the schoolhouse, the highest point in the settlement, his rifle speaking with deadly accuracy. He dropped 3 men in quick succession, driving the attackers back, his face blank and cold as stone. The battle lasted less than an hour. The outlaws, expecting easy pickings, found instead organized resistance and fled, leaving their dead behind. Quentin stood amid the smoke and chaos, his hands shaking, bile rising in his throat. He'd killed again. It had been justified, necessary even, but the blood was still on his hands. Fiona found him behind the schoolhouse, sitting with his head in his hands. She knelt beside him, not speaking, just being present. Finally, he looked up and she saw the anguish in his eyes. I'm sorry you had to see that. Don't apologize for protecting us. You saved lives today. Quentin, you saved the children, the families. You're a hero. I'm not. I'm just a man who's good at killing. No, you're a good man who did what was necessary. There's a difference. She took his face in her hands, forcing him to meet her eyes. And when it was over, when you could have kept fighting, kept killing, you stopped. That's who you are. You choose when and where to use violence. It doesn't control you. He wanted to believe her, needed to believe her. So he let her words wash over him, let her love anchor him, and slowly the shaking stopped. The territorial marshal arrived 2 days later with a posse, tracked down the outlaws, and brought them to justice. He personally thanked Quentin, offering him a deputy's badge. Quentin declined, but he accepted the handshakes and gratitude from the people of Fort Laramie with quiet grace. Life settled back into its rhythm. Winter gave way to spring, and Fiona discovered she was pregnant. The joy on Quentin's face when she told him was almost painful in its intensity. He immediately became overprotective, worrying about her health, insisting she rest more, take fewer risks. "Quentin, I'm pregnant, not fragile." She laughed, pushing his hands away as he tried to carry her over a puddle. "Women have babies all the time. Not my woman, not my baby." His voice was gruff, but his eyes were soft. "I just want you safe. We're safe. We have you." He built an addition onto the cabin, preparing for the baby, throwing himself into the work with fierce dedication. Fiona continued teaching through the summer, training another woman to take over. When the baby came, they made plans, argued about names, dreamed together about the future. In September of 1879, Fiona went into labor. Quentin paced like a caged animal while the midwife worked, terrified in a way he'd never been facing bullets or storms or wild animals. When he finally heard the baby's cry, he sagged with relief. The midwife emerged, smiling. "You have a son. Both mother and baby are healthy." Quentin pushed into the room, his eyes finding Fiona immediately. She looked exhausted but radiant, cradling a tiny bundle wrapped in blankets. When she saw him, she smiled and held out her free hand. "Come meet your son." He approached slowly, almost reverently, and looked down at the baby, his son, so small, so perfect, with a dusting of dark hair and eyes that would probably turn green like his mother's. Something in Quentin's chest cracked wide open, a rush of love so powerful it brought tears to his eyes. "He's beautiful," he whispered. "We're calling him Thomas, after my father, if that's all right with you." "Thomas Frost. It's perfect." He sat carefully on the edge of the bed, wrapping his arm around Fiona, the three of them a complete unit. "I never thought I'd have this, a family, happiness." "Thank you. We're just getting started." Fiona kissed him softly. "This is our beginning." Raising Thomas was both terrifying and wonderful. Quentin, who had survived battles and storms in his own dark past, found himself completely undone by this tiny human who depended on him for everything. He learned to change diapers with the same focused intensity he brought to tracking, mastered the art of soothing a crying infant, spent hours just watching his sons sleep. Fiona returned to teaching when Thomas was 3 months old, and Quentin took over much of the childcare, strapping the baby to his chest in a carrier. Fiona sewed and going about his work. The sight of the huge mountain man with a baby became common in Fort Laramie, and while some found it amusing, most found it endearing. Thomas grew healthy and strong with his mother's green eyes and his father's dark hair. He took his first steps at 10 months, walking determinedly toward Quentin, who crouched with arms open, pride and joy written across his face. His first word was "Papa," and Quentin carried that memory like a treasure. The years passed peacefully. 1880 brought more settlers to Wyoming Territory, and Fort Laramie grew. Fiona's school expanded, requiring a second teacher, and she became known throughout the region for her dedication and innovative methods. Quentin continued trapping, though less extensively, spending more time as a guide for hunters and travelers who paid well for his expertise. In 1881, Fiona became pregnant again. This time, she delivered a daughter with auburn hair and her father's dark eyes. They named her Sarah, and if Quentin had been protective before, he became doubly so now. He doted on both his children, telling them stories, teaching them about the mountains, showing them how to read tracks and identify plants. Thomas, at 2, took his role as big brother seriously, constantly trying to help with the baby, bringing her toys, patting her head gently. Watching his children interact, Quentin felt a contentment he'd never imagined possible. This was redemption, not earned through suffering or sacrifice, but granted through love and family and the simple act of being present. One evening in late summer of 1882, Quentin sat on the porch of their expanded cabin, Thomas on one knee, Sarah drowsing against his chest, watching Fiona tend her garden. The mountains rose around them, the pines whispered their secrets, and the setting sun painted everything gold. "Papa, tell the story about the wolf," Thomas demanded, as he did most nights. "Again? You've heard it 100 times. Please?" Quentin smiled and began the familiar tale. About finding the injured wolf pup and nursing it back to health. About the spring morning when it had returned to the wild. But even as he spoke, his mind drifted, thinking about how far he'd come from those black waters and darker deeds. Fiona joined them, settling beside him, her head on his shoulder. "What are you thinking about? How lucky I am, how I don't deserve any of this, but I'm grateful for it, every day." "You deserve every bit of happiness, Quentin Frost." She tilted her face up to kiss him. "You're a good father, a good husband, a good man. Whatever you were before, this is who you are now. Because of you, you saved me, we saved each other." She gestured to the mountains, the cabin, their children. "This is our reward, for surviving, for finding each other, for being brave enough to start over." As the stars began to appear overhead, Quentin held his family close and finally truly believed her. The past would always be there, the memories and guilt and regrets. But they didn't define him anymore. He was Quentin Frost, husband to Fiona, father to Thomas and Sarah. Mountain man who'd found redemption in the pines. He'd sailed black waters and done things he couldn't speak of. But he'd also found love and built a family and learned that forgiveness, especially self-forgiveness, was possible. The mountains had given him silence when he needed it, but Fiona and the children had given him something better. A reason to speak, to engage, to live fully instead of just surviving. In 1883, Wyoming Territory continued to grow and change. The railroad expanded, bringing more people, more opportunities, and more challenges. Fort Laramie transformed from a rough settlement into a proper town with a real school building, a church, and even a small hospital. Fiona became the principal, overseeing 3 teachers now, her vision for education becoming reality. Quentin adapted to the changes, though not always comfortably. He preferred the wilderness to civilization, but he understood the importance of progress, especially for his children's futures. He took on work as a deputy marshal occasionally, helping track fugitives or mediate disputes, his reputation as a fair but formidable man growing throughout the territory. The nightmares that had plagued him for so long came less frequently now, and when they did, Fiona was always there, her presence enough to calm him. He'd told her everything eventually, every dark deed, every moment of violence and shame from his sailing days. She'd listened without judgment, held him through the telling, and loved him anyway. In the spring of 1884, a stranger rode into Fort Laramie, asking for Quentin Frost. He was a weathered sailor with a familiar look in his eyes, and when Quentin saw him, his blood ran cold. The man had served on the same ship, had participated in the same crimes. For a terrible moment, Quentin feared exposure, feared his past coming to destroy everything he'd built. But the sailor, a man named Collins, hadn't come seeking revenge or blackmail. He'd come seeking the same thing Quentin had found, redemption, and a fresh start. They talked for hours, 2 men bound by shared darkness, and when Collins left, he carried with him directions to good trapping territory, and Quentin's advice: find something worth living for, and hold on to it. The encounter shook Quentin, reminded him how precarious happiness could be, but Fiona, with her usual insight, turned it into a teaching moment. "You helped him," she said that night, lying in his arms. "You could have turned him away, but you gave him hope instead. That's the measure of the man you've become. What if more come? What if the past catches up in a way we can't handle? Then we'll face it together. But Quentin, you can't live in fear of what might happen. You have to trust that what we've built is strong enough to withstand whatever comes." She was right, as she so often was. Quentin resolved to stop looking over his shoulder, to embrace the present and future fully. It wasn't easy. Old habits died hard, but with Fiona's support and his children's laughter filling the cabin, he found it got easier every day. Thomas grew into a bright, curious boy who wanted to know everything about everything. He followed Quentin everywhere, asking endless questions, learning to track and hunt and survive in the wilderness, but he also loved books, spending hours reading with Fiona. showing his father's intelligence combined with his mother's love of learning. Quentin watched his son's development with pride and a fierce determination that Thomas would never know the violence and hardship that had marked his own youth. Sarah was gentler, more contemplative, with an artist's eye for beauty. She collected wildflowers and pressed them in books, drew pictures of the mountains and animals, sang in a voice that made Quentin's throat tighten with emotion. She had her mother's courage, though, and her father's stubbornness, a combination that promised she'd be a force to reckon with when she grew up. In 1885, Fiona became pregnant for the third time. At 32, she was older than many women having children, and the pregnancy was harder than the previous two. Quentin worried constantly, hovering over her, driving her to distraction with his concern. "I'm fine," she insisted, pushing him toward the door. "Go check your trap lines, take Thomas, give me some peace." "But what if the midwife is right in town? I have Sarah here with me, and I'm perfectly capable of resting for a few hours without supervision." She softened, reaching up to cup his bearded cheek. "I love you for worrying, but you need to trust me. I'll be fine." Reluctantly, Quentin took Thomas into the mountains for a few days, teaching him how to set snares, how to read the weather, how to move silently through the forest. It was good to have the time with his son, to pass on knowledge that might someday save his life. But Quentin's thoughts were never far from Fiona, and they headed back to Fort Laramie a day early. They arrived to find the cabin in an uproar. Fiona had gone into labor suddenly 2 months early, and the midwife was with her. Quentin burst through the door, his heart in his throat. To find controlled chaos, the midwife looked up, her face grim. "The baby's coming too soon. It's breech. I've sent for the doctor, but he's out at the Harrison Ranch. Might not make it back in time." Quentin felt the world tilt. Too soon, breech. The words were a death sentence more often than not. He pushed into the bedroom, ignoring the midwife's protests, and went to Fiona's side. She was pale, sweat-soaked, her face contorted with pain. "Quentin," she gasped, gripping his hand with bruising force. "The baby is going to be fine. You're both going to be fine." He smoothed her hair back, projecting a calm he didn't feel. "You're the strongest person I know, Fiona. You can do this." The next hours were the longest of Quentin's life. He stayed by Fiona's side, supporting her through contractions, wiping her face, murmuring encouragement. The midwife worked with skilled hands, trying to turn the baby, and finally, miraculously, succeeding. When their second son finally entered the world, he was tiny, frighteningly so, and he didn't cry immediately. The midwife worked on him frantically while Quentin held Fiona, both of them frozen in terror. Then, a weak mewling sound, building to a proper wail, and the midwife smiled. "He's small, but he's breathing. That's a good sign." The doctor arrived an hour later, examined both mother and child, and gave a cautiously optimistic prognosis. The baby, whom they named Michael, would need careful attention, but he had a fighting chance. Fiona was exhausted but recovering. For weeks, Michael's survival was uncertain. He struggled to nurse, to maintain his body heat, to do all the things that came naturally to most infants. Quentin and Fiona took turns watching over him day and night, willing him to live through sheer force of love. Thomas and Sarah tiptoed around the house, unnaturally quiet, sensing their parents' fear. Slowly, painfully, Michael began to improve. He gained weight, his cries grew stronger, and color came to his pale cheeks. By the time winter arrived, he was still small for his age, but clearly thriving. The relief Quentin felt was almost overwhelming. "We almost lost them both," he said one night, watching Fiona nurse Michael while Thomas and Sarah slept nearby. "I don't know what I would have done, but you didn't lose us. We're all here, all safe." Fiona looked up, her eyes soft. "Life is fragile, Quentin. We've both learned that, but it's also resilient. We survive, we endure. We love each other through the hard times, and we celebrate the good ones. When did you get so wise?" "I married a mountain man. It rubbed off." The scare with Michael's birth made Quentin even more appreciative of every day he had with his family. He cut back on his time in the wilderness, spending more days in Fort Laramie, helping Fiona with the children and the school, being present in a way he hadn't quite managed before. The town had become home in a way the mountains never quite had, because home was wherever Fiona and the children were. In 1886, tragedy struck the territory. A harsh winter killed livestock and game, leaving many families struggling. Quentin used his knowledge of the mountains to hunt for those who couldn't hunt for themselves, sharing meat with families who had none. Fiona organized the school as a distribution center for supplies, using her network of contacts back east to secure donations. The experience brought the community together, breaking down barriers that had existed for years. By the time spring arrived, Fort Laramie was stronger and more unified than ever. Quentin found himself viewed not as a dangerous outsider, but as a pillar of the community, someone people turned to in times of crisis. It was strange, being trusted and respected after so many years of isolation and suspicion. But it felt good too, felt like he'd finally found his place in the world. He'd never be fully comfortable with attention or praise, but he learned to accept it gracefully, for Fiona's sake if not his own. The children grew rapidly, as children do. Thomas at 7 was tall and lean, with his father's quiet intensity and his mother's quick mind. He could track deer through the forest, read advanced books, and had a natural leadership quality that drew other children to him. Sarah at 5 was all grace and creativity, turning everything she touched into art or song, her laugh a constant presence around the cabin. And Michael, despite his rough start, was developing into a sturdy, determined toddler who refused to be left behind by his older siblings. Quentin taught them all the skills he'd learned in his years in the wilderness: how to find water, build shelter, read the stars, survive in conditions that would kill most people. But he also taught them kindness, honesty, the importance of protecting those weaker than yourself. He wanted them to have the strength to survive, but also the compassion to live well. Fiona taught them to read and write, to question and think critically, to see education as a lifelong journey rather than a destination. She filled their heads with stories and their hearts with values, shaping them into thoughtful, caring individuals. Together, she and Quentin created an environment where their children could thrive. In the summer of 1887, Quentin took the whole family up to the mountain cabin for a month. It was the first time Michael had been to the high country, and watching his youngest son's wonder at the towering pines and crystal streams filled Quentin with a deep satisfaction. This was his legacy, he realized. Not the violence of his youth, but the love and knowledge he passed to his children. They spent lazy days fishing and exploring, evenings around the fire telling stories, nights sleeping under more stars than seemed possible. Fiona had always loved the mountains, but seeing them through the children's eyes renewed her own appreciation. They discovered hidden waterfalls, meadows carpeted with wildflowers, and quiet groves where the only sound was wind through branches. One afternoon, while the children played in the stream under Fiona's watchful eye, Quentin stood on a ridge overlooking the valley. The peaks stretched endlessly in every direction, majestic and indifferent, and he felt a profound peace settle over him. He'd come to these mountains broken and seeking only to hide. But the mountains and Fiona, and the life they'd built together, had healed him in ways he'd never thought possible. Beautiful, isn't it? Fiona had climbed up to join him, slipping her hand into his. Yeah, it is. He pulled her close, breathing in the scent of her hair, sunshine, and pine soap. I love you, Fiona, more than I can say. I know, you show me every day. She leaned against him, comfortable in the silence that had drawn them together all those years ago. Are you happy, Quentin? Truly happy? More than I ever thought I could be. You gave me that, you and the children. We gave it to each other. She turned in his arms, looking up at him with those green eyes that still made his heart race. I was running when I came here, just like you. Running from a life that didn't fit, from expectations I couldn't meet, from pain I didn't know how to heal. But I found you, and you helped me stop running. You helped me build something real. Best thing I ever did was catch that horse for you. She laughed. Best thing I ever did was let you. They stood together on that ridge, watching the sun begin its descent, the sky turning shades of orange and purple and gold, and Quentin felt complete in a way he'd never imagined possible. The black waters of his past were still there. The things he couldn't speak of still haunted quiet moments, but they no longer defined him. He was more than his worst moments. He was a husband, a father, a man who had chosen love over darkness and found redemption in the pines. The years continued to pass, marked by seasons and small triumphs. Thomas at 10 decided he wanted to be a lawyer, inspired by stories Fiona told about justice and fairness. Sarah discovered a talent for teaching, often helping her mother at the school. Michael, still small for his age but fierce in spirit, declared he would be a mountain man like his father, a pronouncement that made Quentin's eyes mist even as he laughed. In 1890, Wyoming became a state, no longer just a territory. The change brought celebrations and new opportunities. Fort Laramie continued to grow, and Fiona's school became one of the finest in the region, drawing students from outlying ranches and even other towns. Her reputation as an educator spread, and she received offers to move to larger cities, to take positions with more prestige and better pay. She turned them all down without hesitation. Her life was in Fort Laramie, with Quentin and their children, with the mountains rising in the distance and the community they'd helped build. No amount of money or recognition could tempt her away from that. Quentin's reputation also grew over the years. He became the man people called when there was trouble, a child lost in the wilderness, a criminal on the run, a dispute that needed a fair but firm hand. He never sought the responsibility, but he never shirked it either. His word carried weight throughout the region, and his presence was often enough to prevent violence rather than incite it. The irony wasn't lost on him. The man who had fled his violent past had become known for his ability to handle dangerous situations. But there was a difference now. Everything he did was by choice, done to protect rather than harm, and that made all the difference. In 1891, Fiona turned 38, and Quentin threw her a party that brought together everyone whose lives she'd touched. Over the years, former students, now grown with families of their own, came to thank her. Parents whose children had learned to read in her classroom brought gifts. Fellow teachers shared stories of her dedication and innovation. It was a testament to the impact she'd had, the lives she'd changed through simple persistence and love. Quentin watched her move through the crowd, gracious and radiant, and felt his heart swell with pride. This incredible woman had chosen him, had seen past his scars and shadows to the man he could become, and had loved him into being that man. He would spend the rest of his life being worthy of that gift. Late that night, after the guests had left and the children were asleep, they sat together on the porch swing Quentin had built, watching the stars. "Thank you for today," Fiona said softly. "It was perfect. You deserve perfect. You deserve everything." He kissed her temple. "I never told you this, but that first day, when I saw you fighting with that horse, I thought you were the most beautiful thing I'd ever seen. Terrifying and beautiful and completely out of place. I was out of place. But I found where I belonged. We both did." They sat in comfortable silence, the kind that comes from years of understanding, of knowing each other's thoughts and moods. The mountains rose dark against the star-filled sky. The pines whispered their eternal secrets, and somewhere in the distance a wolf howled. "Do you ever miss it?" Fiona asked. "The solitude of the mountains, before you had all this responsibility, before you had us?" Quentin considered the question honestly. "Sometimes I miss the simplicity, but I wouldn't trade this for anything. The mountains gave me peace when I needed it, but you gave me purpose. You and the children, you're my reason for everything." "Good answer." She snuggled closer. "Because you're stuck with us. Wouldn't have it any other way." As the years moved toward the new century, their children continued to grow and develop their own dreams. Thomas at 15 was serious and studious, already corresponding with universities back east about law programs. Sarah at 13 had become Fiona's assistant at the school, with a natural gift for reaching difficult students. Michael at 9 was all energy and determination, spending every possible moment with his father in the mountains, learning everything Quentin could teach. They were good children, kind and honest and hard-working, and both Quentin and Fiona knew they'd been blessed. There had been challenges, of course. Thomas had broken his arm falling from a tree. Sarah had gone through a phase of adolescent rebellion that tested everyone's patience. Michael's small size made him a target for bullies until his older brother and father taught him how to defend himself. But these were normal problems, the kind every family faced, not the dark, soul-crushing tragedies Quentin had feared his past would bring down on them. His children would never know hunger or violence or the terrible choices that came from desperation. He'd made sure of that. In the spring of 1894, Quentin turned 43. He was still strong, still capable, but he felt the years more than he used to. His joints ached in cold weather, and he couldn't track game for quite as many hours without rest, but he was content with the changes, accepting them as the natural progression of life. That same spring, Thomas received acceptance letters from 3 universities. The pride on Quentin's face when he read them was visible to everyone who knew him. His son, his eldest child, would have opportunities Quentin had never dreamed of, would make something of himself through education and hard work rather than violence and desperation. "I'm proud of you, son," Quentin said, gripping Thomas's shoulder. "So damn proud. I learned from the best." Thomas's voice was thick with emotion. "You and Mama, you gave me everything. I want to make you proud. You already have, every day of your life." Thomas left for university that fall, and the cabin felt strangely empty without him. But he wrote regularly, sharing stories of his classes and new experiences, and he came home for summers, bringing books and ideas and a broader perspective on the world. Quentin listened to his son's plans and dreams with quiet satisfaction, knowing that this was the real victory. Children who would do better than their parents, who would build on the foundation laid for them. Sarah followed her own path, taking over more of the teaching duties at the school as Fiona began to step back slightly. At 16, she was poised and confident, with her mother's grace and her father's determination. She had suitors already, young men drawn to her beauty and intelligence, but she wasn't interested in settling down yet. "I want to travel first," she told her parents, "see something beyond Wyoming, maybe go back east, visit the ocean." The ocean. Quentin felt a familiar tightness in his chest at the word, the old fears rising. But Fiona's hand found his under the table, squeezing gently, and he pushed the anxiety down. "That's a fine goal," he said carefully. "You should see the world, experience different things. Just promise you'll be careful." "I promise, Papa, and I'll come back. This is home. It'll always be home." Michael at 12 showed no interest in leaving. The mountains were in his blood, and he talked constantly about becoming a guide and hunter like his father. Quentin taught him everything he knew, passing on skills and knowledge accumulated over decades, and found a deep satisfaction in the teaching. In 1896, Fiona announced she was retiring from active teaching to focus on administration and curriculum development. At 43, she'd spent nearly 20 years educating children in Fort Laramie, and she wanted to spend more time with Quentin while they were both still healthy and able to enjoy it. They began taking trips together, exploring parts of Wyoming they'd never seen, visiting Thomas at university, taking Sarah on her promised trip to the East Coast. Seeing the ocean again was harder than Quentin expected, the sight and smell bringing back memories he'd thought long buried. But Fiona was there, holding his hand, and he focused on her presence rather than the ghosts. "It's beautiful," Sarah breathed, staring at the endless expanse of water. "I can see why people become sailors." "It's dangerous too," Quentin said quietly. "Beautiful and dangerous, like a lot of things." They spent a week in Boston, seeing where Fiona had grown up, visiting places from her childhood. She showed them the house where she'd lived, the church where her father was buried, the park where she'd first dreamed of something more than the life laid out for her. It was cathartic for her, and Quentin was glad they'd made the trip, even though he was eager to return to the mountains. Michael had stayed home with friends, preferring familiar territory to cities and oceans, and he greeted their return with relief and excitement, full of stories about his adventures. At 13, he was starting to fill out, gaining muscle from constant outdoor activity, though he'd always be smaller than his father or brother. The turn of the century brought reflection and celebration. On January 1st, 1900, the whole family gathered at the cabin, all 3 children home, and they talked late into the night about the past and future. Thomas, now 21 and about to graduate from law school, spoke passionately about justice reform. Sarah, 19 and beautiful, had decided to open her own school in a settlement to the north that had none. Michael, 15 and restless, couldn't wait to start guiding professionally. Quentin listened to his children talk, watched them interact with easy affection and mutual respect, and felt a contentment so deep it was almost painful. This was his legacy, not the violence and blood of his youth, but these 3 remarkable people who would go into the world and make it better. "You did good," Fiona whispered to him as the children debated some political point. "We did good." We did. The new century brought changes. Automobiles began appearing in larger towns, though Fort Laramie was still firmly horse and wagon territory. Electricity came to some buildings, though most homes still relied on lamps and candles. The world was modernizing rapidly, and sometimes Quentin felt like a relic from an earlier age. But the mountains didn't change. The pines still whispered their secrets, the streams still ran cold and clear, and the peaks still stood eternal against the sky. That constancy comforted him, reminded him that some things endured despite the passage of time. In 1902, Thomas passed the bar exam and opened a practice in Cheyenne. His first cases were defending people who couldn't afford lawyers, work that didn't pay well but mattered deeply to him. Quentin helped financially when needed, proud beyond measure that his son had chosen justice over profit. Sarah opened her school in 1903, in a rough mining settlement called Silver Creek. Quentin helped her build the schoolhouse, and Fiona donated books and supplies. It was hard, dangerous work, but Sarah thrived on the challenge, writing home regularly about her students' progress and the community's gradual acceptance. Michael, at 18, began working as a guide, taking hunters and adventurers into the high country. He was good at it, combining his father's knowledge with a natural charisma that put clients at ease. He made decent money and loved every minute of it, coming home with stories that made Fiona worry and Quentin smile with recognition. In 1905, Fiona fell ill. It started as a cough that wouldn't go away, progressed to weakness and weight loss. The doctor in Fort Laramie diagnosed pneumonia, prescribed rest and medicine, but she wasn't improving. Quentin sat by her bedside day and night, reading to her, holding her hand, willing her to get better through sheer force of love. The children all came home. Thomas took a leave from his practice. Sarah closed her school temporarily, and Michael canceled all his guiding contracts. For 2 weeks, they maintained vigil, taking turns sitting with their mother, sharing stories and memories, making sure she was never alone. Slowly, agonizingly, Fiona began to improve. The crisis passed, and though she remained weak, the danger receded. Quentin aged 10 years in those 2 weeks, the fear of losing her more terrifying than anything he'd faced before. When she was finally out of danger, he held her and cried, something the children had never seen. "I'm not going anywhere yet," Fiona assured him, her voice raspy but firm. "We have more years together. I'm not done with you. You better not be. I need you. I know. I need you too." Her recovery was slow but complete. By summer, she was back to her normal activities, though with a new appreciation for each day. She stepped down from most of her administrative duties at the school, finally truly retiring, and spent her time with Quentin, traveling when they felt like it, staying home when they didn't. They fell into a comfortable rhythm, these two people who had found each other against all odds and built a life of meaning and love. Mornings were spent in quiet companionship, reading or talking or simply being together. Afternoons often found them walking through Fort Laramie or riding into the nearby hills. Evenings were for family dinners when the children could join them, or intimate meals for two when they couldn't. In 1907, Thomas married a schoolteacher from Cheyenne named Margaret, a quiet, intelligent woman who shared his passion for justice. The wedding was held in Fort Laramie, and the whole town turned out. Watching his eldest son exchange vows, Quentin remembered his own wedding day, the hope and fear and overwhelming love he'd felt. He saw the same emotions in Thomas's eyes and knew his son would be happy. Sarah was courted by several men but remained focused on her school and her students. She wasn't opposed to marriage, she told her parents, but she refused to settle for anything less than the kind of love they'd shown her was possible. Quentin approved wholeheartedly, though Fiona sometimes worried that Sarah's standards were too high. "She'll find someone worthy when the time is right," Quentin said. "No need to rush." Michael, at 22, was too busy exploring the mountains and guiding clients to think seriously about settling down. He'd inherited his father's love of solitude and the wild, though he was far more social and outgoing. He talked sometimes about building his own cabin in the high country, about making the wilderness his permanent home. In 1908, Quentin turned 57. His hair was more silver than dark now, his face weathered by decades of mountain sun and wind, but he was still strong, still capable. He'd cut back on the physical labor, let Michael take over most of the hunting and guiding, but he could still track better than men half his age and read the wilderness like a familiar book. That summer, he and Fiona took a long trip into the mountains, just the two of them, like the old days. They rode to the cabin where they'd spent their first days together, found it still standing, though weathered by time. They stayed there a week, reliving memories, making new ones, talking about the life they'd built. "Do you have regrets?" Fiona asked one night, lying in his arms before the fireplace. "Things you wish you'd done differently?" Quentin thought about it carefully. "I regret what I did before I came here. The violence, the blood, the waste of it all. But I don't regret anything after that first day when I saw you. Every choice I made from that moment on led to this, and this is everything I could want. Even the hard times, Michael's birth, my illness, all the struggles, especially those. They taught us how strong we are, how much we can endure together." He tightened his arms around her. "I wouldn't change a single moment of our life together. Good, neither would I." They returned to Fort Laramie refreshed and reconnected, ready for whatever the future held. Thomas and Margaret announced they were expecting their first child, making Quentin and Fiona grandparents-to-be. Sarah's school in Silver Creek had grown to need a second teacher, a testament to her success. Michael had saved enough money to buy his own land in the mountains, planning to build a cabin and expand his guiding business. In the spring of 1909, Thomas and Margaret had a daughter they named Fiona after her grandmother. Holding his granddaughter for the first time, Quentin felt emotions he couldn't quite name. This tiny person represented the future, a continuation of the family he and Fiona had created. She would never know the darkness of his past, would grow up safe and loved and free. That was his true redemption, he realized. Not just his own transformation, but ensuring future generations would never face what he had faced. "She's perfect," Fiona whispered, tears streaming down her face as she watched Quentin cradle the baby. "We're grandparents, can you believe it?" "Barely. Feels like yesterday you were telling me about Thomas." He smiled down at the sleeping infant. "But it's good, it's right." They settled into the role of grandparents with enthusiasm, doting on little Fiona whenever Thomas and Margaret visited. The cabin filled with laughter and joy, and Quentin found himself thinking less and less about the past. The present was too full, too rich to waste time on what couldn't be changed. In 1910, Sarah fell in love. His name was Robert Crawford, a surveyor working in the Silver Creek area, and he was everything Quentin could want for his daughter: kind, honest, hard-working, and utterly devoted to Sarah. When Robert asked for Sarah's hand, Quentin gave his blessing readily, seeing in the young man's eyes the same love he'd felt for Fiona all those years ago. They married in the summer of 1911, another joyous celebration that brought the family together. Watching Sarah in her wedding dress, radiant and confident, Quentin remembered the little girl who had drawn pictures and sung songs, and marveled at the woman she'd become. Michael remained unmarried, focused on his business and his love of the mountains. He'd built a beautiful cabin in a remote valley, and he split his time between there and Fort Laramie, guiding clients through the seasons, living the life Quentin had once lived. But Michael had none of the darkness or baggage Quentin had carried. He was simply a man who loved the wilderness and had found a way to make a living from that love. As Quentin approached 60, he found himself reflecting more on legacy and meaning. He'd lived longer than most men of his rough background had any right to expect. He'd seen his children grow into good, successful adults. He'd loved and been loved by an extraordinary woman. He'd found redemption for sins he'd thought unforgivable. One evening in the fall of 1912, he and Fiona sat on their porch, wrapped in blankets against the chill, watching the sun set behind the mountains. They were 61 and 59 respectively, their faces lined by time but their love as strong as ever. "I've been thinking," Quentin said slowly, "about writing things down, my story, from the sailing days to now. Not for publication but for the grandchildren, so they know where they come from, the full truth." Fiona considered this. "That's a big undertaking. Are you ready to revisit all of it?" "I think I need to, before it's too late, before the memories fade or I'm not here anymore. They should know the truth, that people can change, that redemption is possible, that love can heal even the deepest wounds. Then I'll help you. We'll write it together, our story." They spent the winter working on the manuscript, Quentin dictating while Fiona wrote, occasionally adding her own perspective and memories. It was painful at times, reliving the worst moments, but also cathartic. By the time spring arrived, they had a complete account, honest and unflinching, of their journey from darkness and desperation to love and family. They sealed it in a box with instructions that it be given to their grandchildren when they were old enough to understand. It was their legacy, the final piece of the story, proof that no matter how dark the past, the future could be bright if you had the courage to change and someone to love you through it. In 1913, Michael surprised everyone by bringing home a young woman named Elizabeth, a widow with a 5-year-old son. She was quiet and practical, with sad eyes that Quentin recognized. She'd lost her husband to a mining accident and was struggling to survive in Silver Creek when Michael had met her. "I know it's sudden," Michael said, introducing her to his parents, "but I love her and I love her son. I want to marry her, give them a home." Quentin looked at Elizabeth, saw the hope and fear warring in her expression, and remembered another woman who had come to Wyoming Territory seeking a new beginning. "Welcome to the family," he said warmly, and watched relief flood her face. They married quietly in 1914, and Michael proved to be a devoted husband and father to his stepson, Peter. The cabin he'd built in the mountains became a home for his new family, and he continued guiding while Elizabeth took over the cooking and domestic duties that Michael had never been good at. Thomas and Margaret had 2 more children, a son named Quentin and another daughter named Grace. Sarah and Robert had their first child, a son named Matthew, in 1915. The family grew and expanded, bringing new life and energy to gatherings. Quentin, now in his mid-60s, slowed down considerably. His joints ached constantly, and he tired more easily. But he was content, surrounded by children and grandchildren, secure in the knowledge that his life had meant something. The darkness of his past was still there, would always be there, but it was overshadowed by the light of what he'd built. In 1916, as war raged in Europe and the world seemed to be tearing itself apart, Quentin and Fiona celebrated their 38th wedding anniversary. It was a quiet celebration, just the 2 of them, dinner by candlelight in the cabin they'd shared for so many years. 38 years, Fiona mused. Sometimes it feels like yesterday, sometimes like forever. "Best years of my life," Quentin said simply. "Every single one of them. Mine too." She reached across the table to take his hand, her fingers thin and delicate in his calloused grip. "I love you, Quentin Frost, more now than ever. I love you too, more than words can say." They sat together in the quiet cabin, 2 people who had found each other against impossible odds and built a life of meaning and love. Outside, the pines whispered in the wind, the same sound that had welcomed Quentin all those years ago when he'd come to the mountains seeking silence. He'd found silence, yes, but he'd found so much more. He'd found love and family and redemption. He'd found Fiona, who had seen past his scars to the man he could become and had loved him into being that man. He'd found children who made him proud, grandchildren who would carry the family forward into the future. He'd sailed black waters and done things he couldn't speak of, things that would haunt him to his last breath. But he'd also found peace in the pines, found love in the most unexpected place, and built a life that mattered. That was his redemption, not earned through suffering or sacrifice, but granted through love and the simple act of choosing to be better than his past. As the candles burned low and Fiona's head rested on his shoulder, Quentin Frost, former sailor, mountain man, husband, father, and grandfather, closed his eyes and smiled. The journey had been long and often painful, but it had led him exactly where he needed to be, home.